primary purposes of the B-26 Marauder Historical Society is the preservation of Marauder artifacts, memorabilia, and history.
We'd like to hear about your experience with the B-26 from your first flight to your experience at the Battle of Midway. And start off by telling us a little bit about yourself.
I'm Lieutenant Colonel James P. Muri, USAF retired. I joined the Army Air Corps in December of 1936 and progressed as a soldier, Chinook Field, March Field. Became a flying cadet in October of 1940 in Glendale, California, and then to Randolph and Kelly, graduating in the class of 41D in 1941.
What is your first experience flying a B-26? I understand happened at Langley Field. Tell us something about that.
Lieutenant Mike Michaelis came out and says, "Let me introduce you to your new airplane." And there, sitting on the ramp, was, along with many others, was an old clip-wing B-26 with a tail number 13. And we crawled up in the cockpit, and Mike says, "Now here's the way you start it." And he showed me the procedure for starting the airplane. A brand new co-pilot was assigned, and he says, "There's 2 or 3 things you should remember about the airplane. One, it's all electric. So if you have trouble on takeoff, you must throw this switch and do this and do that. Your approach speed should not be under 150 miles an hour. So go fly." And we did. Well, that was an experience. We went around the traffic pattern, and the airplane didn't fly like the B-25 flew. It had a way of flying all of its own. And we came in at 150 miles an hour, so a lot of speed. And we couldn't hold the altitude on the final approach like you would in a B-25. And just by a lot of good luck, we got over some trees and on the ground, and then we decided we'd better start checking this airplane out and find out just what makes it run. Well, we got all the people together, and through classes and a lot of ifs and ands and buts, we all decided how to fly the machine.
So I understand that 22nd Bomb Group was transitioning from the States through Hawaii to Australia. How was it that you ended up at the Battle of Midway instead of in Australia?
As 3 airplanes would come online, they would be checked out, compasses swung and so forth. And when they were ready to go, a flight leader and 2 wingmen were assigned, and they'd take off for Australia. The group as a whole had pretty well departed, and there were 4 of us left, 4 crews left in Honolulu, waiting some relics that had been cannibalized, and one had been in an accident and so forth. And we were to come down as again the tail end Charlies when they were all ready to go. Well, in the meantime, the Japanese fleet got to cruising around out in the Pacific, and the necessary people got worried, and we were told we would be held up for a while, pending the outcome of this Japanese fleet movement. And then a couple of airplanes, the B-26s, came in from the States. 3 of them, Jim Collins and 2 wingmen, in the B-26B airplanes. And we trained a bit in loading and unloading bombs and whatnot, and then somebody got the idea that we ought to be carrying torpedoes. If we're going to fight a Navy, we better know how to drop torpedoes. So General Arnold, who of course was then at the time the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Corps, was a fiend for aerial torpedoes. He thought that was the greatest weapon that you could use against a surface ship. And sure enough, we got together with the Navy at Fort Island, and we moved our airplanes over to Fort Island to install aerial torpedoes, which in itself was a rather frightening sort of a thing. In the first place, the mat, not runway, a mat at Fort Island was, I think, 2,200 feet long. And the B-26 was just hard-pressed to get stopped before he flew off the end of the seawall. And in fact, one of the B-26s left his gear on the seawall and was trying to land, so we were reduced by one again. We were back down to Jim Collins having two, and so on. Well, we put out an aerial torpedo, and the Navy officers that were there, and our own, of course, Army officers, wanted to see what it looked like flying overhead. So two of us took off and flew around and got to buzz Port Island a few times, and in landing, the question was, since the torpedo was swung under the fuselage, would we drag when the struts depressed on landing? But they didn't, so we were then equipped with aerial torpedoes to go back to Hickam. We spent a whole night taking torpedoes off and putting bombs in the bomb bay. Then somebody would say, no, we got to have torpedoes. So we take the bombs out and put the torpedoes back on. And this went on and until finally daylight came, and they said, well, we've got orders for you. And you're going to head for a runway, and they give us a heading and the distance. They never did say Midway Island, but so we threw our gear together and took off for Midway Island, not knowing what we were getting into. Nobody told us there was a big Japanese fleet going in that area. We just knew that we were out there for some reason. Midway Island, Eastern Island, where we were based, was small. The longest runway was, well, there's only one, about 4,000 feet. There was a little cross runway of, it was about 2,500 feet, and that was the whole island. Revetments were immediately adjacent to the runway, and if there had been a ground loop or something on takeoff, it would have wound up right within the revetments themselves. So we hung around there for a few days, and we'd get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and check the airplane out, and the old airplane being what she was, never had any problems. The engines run good, the airplane is in good shape. The mechanics had no problems with it, so we'd get in the airplane at 3:30, 4 o'clock and run the engines and make sure they were warm, and then stand by.
Wow, this is amazing. At less than age 25, most of these crews were preparing for their first battle and didn't even know it. What did you hear the day of the Battle of Midway to send you off on your mission?
And then one day they said there's a target. And they gave us the heading and distance, and away we went, not knowing if it was a merchant ship, it was an aircraft carrier, or what it was. And we had no more than cleared the island, and you could look up and see the Japanese Zeros and dive bombers in waves coming in to hit the little island of Midway, both Eastern Island and Sand Island. But we went on out and were down low, 50, 100 feet off the water, and suddenly popped over the horizon was a whole flock of Japanese ships, and they were everywhere. The first ones we encountered were destroyers. They were way out in front of the main battle fleet, and of course our course was such that we had to fly directly over top of them. Well, we were just buzz over top of the mast and back on the water and head for the next one, up over the top of it and down in the water. And our gunners were keeping busy, firing as we approached and as we left. But then the Zeros picked us up. And that's where the problems came in. The anti-aircraft fire was ineffective. Scary, absolutely scary, but ineffective. They, I don't think, hit our airplane, period. And I know they didn't hit one of the other ones. The other one that got back to the island wasn't hit by any aircraft fire. It was all Zeros. And in order to approach our target, which was the carrier Akagi, at a 45-degree angle from the bow, we had to cross this great expanse of water where every ship fired their anti-aircraft guns. And that was a bad one because the big guns were shooting into the water, causing water spouts that we had to duck. And the Navy had instructed us that we had to drop at 150 miles an hour at 150 feet. Well, the airplane didn't fly 150 miles an hour. That was almost stall speed. So we were somewhat higher than that when we crossed this barrage area. And the Zeros, you got to give them credit, were right with us. They went through that barrage area just the same as we did, and they were shooting us all the way through. And again, I can say that the anti-aircraft fire did not hit my airplane. I can't speak for the other two that were shot down. But our course took us, after our launch, the Akaga was turning toward us, and we had been coming in from 45 off the bow, so it was almost a straight shot down the flight deck, which was fortunate simply because every gun on the carrier was firing out and up, 45 degrees, and just steady fire. So anybody flying over the deck, that is across it, was going to get hit. There wasn't any question. But nobody had prepared for some airplane flying the full length of their deck. And that's where we went, down the deck, and in fact low enough that I think we could have touched the deck with our wheels if we had put them down. But I tried to climb out and get into the clouds when I left the deck. And those carriers were firing, I don't know what size guns, but great, huge fire gold whistling by the cockpit. It was just balls of fire from the anti-aircraft. And they, of course, were tracers. And then on top of that, the Zeros were sitting firing at us. So we didn't get into the clouds and had to go back down in the water. Well, by that time, all the cushions in the back of the airplane were on fire. The gunners were shot up, and we had no defense except speed. And we got on the water. The co-pilot went back and used the tail gun and shot morphine into the wounded and so forth. And I sat there driving that machine with the throttles all the way to the hilt. Now, B-26 pilots will remember that our takeoff power was 49 inches of mercury. 50 was emergency. Well, we went by the 50, went across the space and started at 20, and we went on through 20 up to 30. So we were drawing somewhere, the Pratt & Whitney people figured along about 80 inches of mercury on those engines with full RPM, and we're indicating about 320 miles an hour. Fast enough that a Zeros coming down out of dives could pull up alongside of us, but when they rolled up to fire through and try to shoot us out of the air, they just simply fell off, and we would go on. But we'd been shot up so bad that the airplane was flying a bit hazardously. It'd try to make a turn, and it'd want to fall off on us. The rudder was shaking and banging, and the engines were pounding pretty badly, which we didn't know was all the blades of the propellers were perforated. Some were hit with pretty big rounds because great gaping chunks of steel were torn out of those props, and just small slivers were left holding them on, which of course speaks well for the maker of the propeller.
Wow. So you managed to get away from the Zeros, and then what happened?
But we did finally get away from the Japanese Zeros. And then, of course, we were lost. Nobody was thinking about position or where was Midway or anything else. We were away from the Japanese fleet, and we had a lot of wounded and bad damage to the airplane. So we decided to do a little checking here, and our navigator, who had been ducking any aircraft fire and Zero fire in the navigator's compartment, finally decided it was time to start converting knots to miles and see where we were. The problem was that his cables ended at about 250 miles an hour, converting to knots, and here we were cruising along at 320. So we got into trouble trying to figure that out, and had in fact started a square search because we were lost. And we had started on our second round of the square search, and we spotted a smudge of smoke on the horizon, and we turned toward it, and sure enough, that was Sand Island burning. Well, we had it made until we started our procedures for landing and discovered that there wasn't any hydraulic pressure, since that was all destroyed. One wheel was shot off. The airplane was handling at slower speeds real bad. And we got on a final approach and thought, well, this is it. We've got it made now. And the Marines didn't know who we were, and they cut loose with their anti-aircraft weapons and drove us back out to sea. And we couldn't pull the gear up because we didn't have any hydraulic fluid. Couldn't do anything with the flaps. And the engines were getting awfully tired, and the airplane was flying bad. So in the next round, when we got on finally, we had to come in and land. There was no place else to go. And whether they suddenly realized that we were friendly or not, I don't remember, but they quit shooting, and we came in and made a reasonably decent landing and wound up nosing down into one of the revetments because the one wheel was gone, and when we finally got stopped, the airplane had shook itself so badly in the landing that the instrument panel had fallen out, the bomb sight had fallen off the mounts and was down laying in the plexiglass. Poor old girl was in bad shape. And we got on, finally unloaded and got the wounded out and got them some medical attention, and went back and started counting. And one side there were over 500 holes, just on one side. We never did count the other side. And the Marines came along with their tractor and drug us off down into a revetment and said, we have to get you out of the way here. So we started digging foxholes and waiting then for the Japs to come in and get at us. But the airplane itself was shot something horrible. And as you looked at the blades of the propeller, you wonder how they held on with all the holes that were in the imbalance. But they did. They just shook a bit, but not one blade was damaged beyond use. The engines were dripping oil and the gas tanks were all oozing gas. They weren't pouring out because we had the self-sealing tank. But the airplane was tough. It was extremely tough. And I doubt seriously that regular combat airplane could have stood up to his B-26 did. Last I saw of 1392 was when I left her. She was sitting in the revetment, and I guess it's still out there for all I know.
All of the air crewmen who flew on this mission were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. At this particular ceremony at Hamilton Field, California, on November 1st, 1942, the DSC was presented to Mrs. Herbert C. Mays for her husband, who was lost on the Midway mission. For many years, it was believed that one of the Jap carriers had been sunk by B-26s. The fact that none were does not minimize the contribution that Marauders made, for they were the first American planes to attack. And as Jim Muri says,
if anybody was to say, what did you contribute? I would say this. It caused the Japanese fighters to stay in the water. They were down shooting us. And the dive bombers off of our carriers managed to get in at whatever altitude was reasonably high for those type of airplanes, and made their dives and got their hits, and then it was too late for the Zeros. Nothing they could do about it anymore.